Amid the ongoing military operations in Ukraine, U.S. President Joe Biden went to Europe, where a NATO summit was held on March 24th. Despite Kiev's attempts to involve NATO in a war with Russia and establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, the alliance has once again confirmed its unwillingness to get into a military confrontation with the Russian army. Instead, the alliance has decided to strengthen the defense of its own territories. 4 additional multinational NATO combat groups of 40,000 troops will be deployed in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania and Slovakia on a permanent basis. Biden offered to Ukraine to resolve territorial issues with Moscow itself, but left the opportunity for the alliance to use force against Russia. The U.S. president noted that NATO could intervene in the conflict in the case of the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. Given the example of false flag chemical weapon attacks in the war in Syria, the risks of provocation by the Kiev regime and the threat to civilians and military alike on the territory of Ukraine have increased. Poland's proposal to deploy NATO military units in Ukraine was rejected. However, this does not exclude the possibility of Poland's participation in the war in Ukraine outside the alliance. Warsaw intends to introduce its contingent in the western regions of Ukraine to support the fraternal Ukrainian people and not to miss the opportunity to establish its own control over the historically disputed territories. Apparently, this will be the main topic of negotiations between Biden and Duda on March 25th. If Biden allows Poland to send troops to Ukraine, it will most likely push Belarus to enter the conflict in order to take control of the regions of Polisie and Volyn. The Kiev authorities have completely destroyed the sovereignty of the state, and in the new realities, Ukraine risks losing almost all its territories and ceasing to exist. At the same time, NATO member countries continue to participate in the conflict through the deployment of mercenaries sent to Ukraine as volunteers and through weapon supplies. European leaders are noting that their ability to continue supplying military equipment is also limited. On March 24th, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced that the UK will provide Kiev government forces with 6,000 missiles in addition to the 4,000 In-Law and Javelin anti-tank missiles already supplied. Johnson declared his readiness to consider Zelensky's request for the transfer of tanks and aircraft to the AFU. However, realizing the risks and the price of such supplies, he complained about some difficulties with logistics. The reaction of Western countries to military operations in many ways reaches the absurd and confirms that their leaders are largely unaware of the realities of the new emerging world order. Joe Biden at a press conference in Brussels called for the exclusion of Russia from the G20, despite the lack of support for such a decision from all members of the organization. He called for inviting Ukraine to take Russia's place to participate in the upcoming summit. The official representative of the Chinese Foreign Ministry commented on the issue and noted that Moscow is an important member of the G20 and no country has the right to exclude another country. Europe is outraged that Moscow is taking retaliatory measures against the imposed sanctions. The head of the European Commission has said that Russian oil and gas companies will not be allowed to demand payment for fuel in rubles, despite the fact that there is no more effective means of putting pressure on the Russian companies. The hysteria of Western leaders over Russia's transition to payments for the supply of energy resources in rubles demonstrates that the Western leadership still cannot realize and accept the new reality. Today, the shouts of Washington, London, and Brussels have become perceived only as an annoying squeak by Russia as well as a number of world political centers. Initially, the reason for the entire conflict in Ukraine was the West's attempts to solve its own economic problems at the expense of Russian resources. The economies of Western countries are slowly but surely moving towards collapse. One of the few ways out is to get access to large quantities of cheap energy, natural resources, and foodstuffs. This could only be achieved by dividing Russia into several small parts that are in a state of permanent conflict under Western control. The West has brainlessly destroyed almost all the means of interaction and therefore of pressure on Moscow on its own. The dynamics of the development of geopolitical and geoeconomic processes are highly likely to lead to a pan-European military conflict in the foreseeable future at best. In the worst case, they may lead to a global nuclear war.